Welcome to Running for Real, a global community with a shared love and curiosity for running. Together we reconnect with the reasons why we love to run and discover ways it helps us become better people. Whether it's the quiet moments of a morning run while the rest of the world still sleeps, or befriending the strangers next to you at the start line of a race, we are here to connect with others who see running as the common thread that weaves our lives together. Come join me, Tina Muir, as I talk with people from all walks of life, united by a love of running. Hello, my friends. Welcome to episode 361 of the Running for Real podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm, as always, excited that you are here. And today, I want to begin with a bit of a confession as to how this episode came about. So you probably know that I ran as a professional athlete and I have been dipping my toes in the water of ultra running, considering maybe trying some of the, what I consider much longer distances. 100k and 100 miles still seems a bit impossible to me, but maybe someday. And I thought I had everything down when it came to fueling. I knew I wasn't getting enough food in terms of my amenorrhea as a professional athlete, but I thought the during running fuel side of it, I was nailing. And I confidently kept pushing away one of my best friends, Elizabeth, who is a dietitian. I kept pushing her away saying, I don't need to have a conversation about this. And eventually she said, look, we need to talk about this. This was about 2 months before my ultra. And Elizabeth sat me down and she said, we do need to talk about this. And we talked about this and I suddenly realized how wrong I was. And in that moment, it suddenly dawned on me that I had so much to learn. My stomach had so much to practice and how much I had given away in the past by not being fueled. So today is where this came about. It is also why I'm now working with precision, and you will see why after this episode. And this episode is literally your questions about nutrition, about fueling, about electrolytes, about hydration, all of it asked to Andy Blow, who is the co-founder of Precision Fuel and Hydration. He is also a sports scientist. And so I thought this would be the ideal opportunity for us to get all of our questions answered. So you will hear so many questions from our community. I put it out there. I got a lot of responses and I think we answered all of them, or at least answered all the questions within other questions. So without any further ado, let's get to this conversation with Andy Blow. Make sure you save this episode for another day and keep it for when you are preparing for your races. Let's go. Thank you to Allbirds for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. Thank you for their support, for all that they do, and the work that they continue to put in environmentally to do the right thing, even though they are a public company. And by the way, did you see their announcement? They have shown the photo of Moonshot, the world's first net zero carbon shoe. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can go check that out. Really cool design. I'm very excited. It's going to be coming spring 2024. And when I say the first net zero carbon shoe, that means that there are no emissions. They found a way to balance out emissions without using offsets. The materials they are using, the way they are creating this product is adding zero carbon to our atmosphere. So go check that out. But today I want to talk to you about a different pair of shoes that I've mentioned in passing, but these are one of my favorites. I've mentioned to you that I love the tree flyers for my runs, and I do run many of my runs in them. I also wore them for the last 4 marathons I have done. So they are wonderful for that distance. They are my favorite running shoe right now. And also I've mentioned to you the Dashers, the tree Dashers are my favorite day-to-day go-to shoe that I'm wearing most of the time. I definitely recommend both of those. However, I want to talk to you today about the tree loungers. Now these are my shoes that I take with me on trips, because they are ideal for going from daytime to nighttime. I have worn them for walking around all day. I have worn them for going out in the evening to fancy restaurants, like the kind of restaurants that have like caviar. Not that I go to those very often, but occasionally when I get invited to a meal somewhere like that, I have worn my Allbirds tree loungers. Really comfortable shoes. They look great. They come in all kinds of cool colors. And yes, sustainably made, of course. They are slip on and go. Made of eucalyptus tree fiber, which is going to give you lots of comfort, and they are very, very cushioned. So you can go to allbirds.com and you can, if you actually use the link in the show notes, you can get a free pair of socks with your order. So I would recommend using the show notes link to go get yourself a pair of those. Also checking out the tree flyers and the dashers. If you use the link in the show notes, you can get a free pair of socks with your order by adding it to the cart. Go check out allbirds.com. Andy, I am excited to welcome you to the Running For Real podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Tina.
Yeah, I'm excited. I haven't done this in a while, but where I've asked my community to give me the questions, what would they like to know, and what they would like to know, or questions they asked. I don't know what the backwards way of saying something is, but I'm trying to do that. They asked a lot of questions. We have a lot of things to cover, all things that are very, very common questions. And as you know, as my community knows, myself dipping my toes in the ultra world, I am in a whole new world of learning too. And I think for me, that was best demonstrated by the fact that Ryan Montgomery, who was my crew, my pacer, one of my best friends, said to me, like, and you said this to me, and our mutual friend, another one of my close friends, Elizabeth in Pine, also said to me, eat on the start line. And I didn't, because for me, the concept of that was so alien that it just didn't even enter my mind, even though all three of you had told me to do so. So there's a lot we're going to cover today. But first, I'm going to start with something totally different, which is something I love about you and everyone at Precision, and that is your out of office emails. So please tell me where, so for the listeners, everyone at Precision, when you email them when they're out of office, sends these really funny, very individual, often contain memes or some kind of funny picture. Where did that come about, and why did you decide to start doing that? Because we're also used to, hello, I will be out of office until this date. I will respond upon my return or something. But you don't do that. And why is that like a thing you all do? Because I love it.
It's kind of evolved over the years. So really credit to Dave and Chris in our marketing team, who are the spearhead for that. Because I don't know whether it was Dave or Chris that did the first funny out of office, but one of them did, and it might well have been Chris. And then it got quite a nice response from a few people who'd emailed back and said, just got to say, I wouldn't normally do this, but your out of office like really made me laugh. And I think a lot of it is because of what you've described. It's so unexpected. Like when you see an out of office come in, you think it's going to be very dry. And Chris is fantastic at putting the GIFs and the memes in there and telling a little story about where he's at and what's going on, and usually involving what his son's up to. His son's like 2 years old, and what he's up to and that kind of thing. And I think it just humanizes it. And as a brand, we go out of our way to interact with people that want to, interact with the company. We're not a kind of faceless thing. When you normally phone up a customer service line and you have to hit 7 different buttons so they can try and fob you off with a web page instead of talking to a person. Yes. We're kind of the opposite of that. And we try and have a bit of personality and try to actually interact with people. And honestly, Chris's email or Dave's email got such a warm response that Dave then suggested, he said, we should do this. This should be a thing, and it should be a competition, like who can do the best ones. And so it has spread amongst the company. And now people will specifically email. People ask me when Chris or Dave is going to be on holiday so they can email them to see they're out of office. That's how out of hand it's got.
I love it. And I encourage everyone listening. I think I'm going to try and do it as well. It really does bring a little bit of joy. Like an out of office email is typically the opposite of joy. It's just another hassle in your day. It's just another thing to delete. But this is, it really does bring me joy every time I see one of your emails come through. So I encourage you as listeners to try it, do something individual and make it very personal, make it very fun, and see what kind of response you get in your own life. And I wanted to start with that just because I thought that was something that really has made me smile in a way that I didn't expect. Yeah. Okay. Now today we are going to ask you all the questions about fueling, hydration, everything that runners could want to know about this topic, because you are a sports scientist, you are a co-founder of Precision Fuel and Hydration because you struggled in your own career, primarily triathlon, as an elite athlete. But I wanted to go into this in detail because I think this is going to be an episode that people can go back to. So is there anything you want to say to start with that maybe is, I don't know, the most common question that you get, or something that you want to begin this conversation with saying before we start getting into the specifics and I ask you things that my community has asked?
Yeah, I reckon I've got two things that are worth starting with. One of them is a really fundamental thing around what we should be talking about when we talk about in exercise, fueling and hydration. And that is that nutrition is a very broad topic. Like day-to-day nutrition is a huge and complex, and it has physiological complexity, it has cultural complexity, it has personal complexity for people, and lots of people bring lots of different attitudes and experiences with food, and that's a massive topic. But fueling when you're doing an activity doesn't have to be really complicated and really different. It's very, very simple, really. And kind of the sports nutrition industry has made it seem a lot more complicated than it needs to be, because fundamentally when you're running, in this case, if we're talking about running as the primary sport, you are going to need three things while you're running to keep going for a very long time. And that is, you're going to need fuel, usually in the form of carbohydrate. You're going to need fluid, usually water or a drink of some sort to replace what you're losing in your sweat. And beyond a certain point of sweating, with that fluid, you're going to need electrolytes. And the main one you're going to need is sodium. So you kind of need three things. You need carbs, fluid, and sodium when you're doing endurance exercise. And if you get basically the right amount of those three things in, then you have done a great job and you will perform really well. So what you eat before exercise, around exercise, day to day, what you have for breakfast, all of that, that's a whole separate and way more complicated topic. But the fundamentals of like what you eat when you're exercising is, do you know how much carb, how much fluid, how much sodium you need? If you can nail that, you'll get it right. And I think that's a good way to sort of introduce the topic, is rather than make it more mystical, is like try and demystify it. The other thing that I think is worth saying with regards to runners is that, as a rule, and this is a gross generalization, but as a rule, I find that attitudes towards fueling and hydration in running are slightly different than they are in, say, cycling or triathlon, where athletes are a lot more comfortable generally with the idea of consuming quite a lot of calories, quite a lot of fluids and electrolytes when they're exercising. I think that's partly cultural. I think it's partly practical, because it's difficult to consume things when you're running compared with when you say on a bike.
So you're saying runners aren't good at that, or runners are good at that?
Not so good. Not so good in general. Like ultra distance runners, maybe, especially experienced ones, become very good at it because they have to. But a lot of runners, when we start running, when you start cycling, quite often, very quickly, you'll be out riding for more than 90 minutes or 2 hours, and you get into the territory where you need to eat and drink, and you learn quickly. And the culture of cycling is to have gels and bars in your pockets and bottles of drink on your frame, and you drink and you eat, and that's just part of the sport. You learn it. I learned that as a junior rider, as a young runner or as a novice runner. Most of your runs, you might be starting off with 15 or 20 minute runs or less. And it takes you a very long time before you build up to the sort of durations of running where drinking and eating during running is even necessary. So, I mean, you obviously ran marathons and you know a lot about marathon running. Like, even as a marathon runner, there might only be one session a week or even one session a fortnight when you're running for long enough that you might need to eat and drink during that session.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I just don't think runners, it's part of the culture of running to think about eating and drinking when you're running. But of course, when you go up to ultra distance running, as you're learning now, you really have to become good at it and you have to embrace it. And I think that part of the conversation for runners around fueling and hydration is just acknowledging that if you've come from shorter distance background, maybe this is something that's going to be new to you and you've got to approach it, with an open mind.
Okay, related to that, I can't help but jump to, I think you're right, it's partly culture, but I also wonder how much of it is about people go into running because they hear that it's the quickest way to lose weight. And so a lot of people come to the sport, as you said, like starting with 20 minutes or so, and or 20 minutes, let's say building up to an hour, but they get to that hour and they're like, well, I don't want to eat a gel as my like calories when I'm trying to lose weight. If I'm going to have those calories, I want them to be something I want to eat. Do you think that is a piece of it, that cycling isn't typically something that people go to for weight loss, but running is?
It might well be. I think it could apply. It could apply in both scenarios, but I certainly agree with you that I think people, if weight loss or weight control is a big part of your motivation for exercising or running in particular, then definitely it probably does feel a bit wasteful or almost a bit OTT to be consuming lots of simple sugars and things when you're exercising, even though counterintuitively that might actually help with your goals or your weight management goals in some ways, because there's an equation whereby, if you fuel adequately, you can do better work, better quality work, you can sustain it more, you can get more consistency. So I think that's also probably part of it, is that abstinence is kind of, we want to be tough. Endurance athletics is generally quite tough. You kind of lean into the idea of it hurting more or being a bit tougher to complete. Not eating very much makes it tougher, and maybe that's all part of that psychology. So, yeah, I don't think that's I don't think that there's anything misleading in that. I think that's also part of it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so on that note, first question from the community is from Julia, which is, and I'm just going to try and weave this into following some kind of path here. So related to what we were just talking about there, you mentioned about pre, during, post run, how do runners know how much to be taking in? And related to that, you said about endurance runs, like you should be eating on the run. What is the amount of time that you would say is where you should start eating during the run?
Yeah, so in terms of working out how much you might need to consume when you're running to fuel your performance, the equation that you're looking at is the length and a combination of the length and the intensity of a run. And generally speaking, the longer and harder a run goes on, the more you'll need to consume on an hourly basis to sustain that performance. And that's just based on the fact that you have a finite amount of stored energy in your body that you can access to keep going at a high intensity. That's glycogen stored in the muscles is the primary form of fuel that you access when you're running. And that will normally see you through 90 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer if you're well trained. But as such, as a general rule, most activities, if you start them well fueled, anything under an hour, you're not going to need significant, if any, fuel.
What would you say is well fueled? Like for someone maybe getting up in the morning, what would that be?
If it means different things to different people, but if you have had an adequate amount of fuel carbohydrate the day before in your diet, you're not waking up super hungry and feeling lightheaded or like you need to eat immediately. If you have, it's kind of working it out in reverse. If you've got enough fuel to do your first training session of the day comfortably, then you are well fueled. I got up this morning at 5, I went for a swim at 6. All I had in between times was a coffee. And then I come back and have a really big breakfast after that, because for me, that's a little bit early to be eating a significant amount beforehand. I also didn't train yesterday though, so I was pretty confident that I'm not going to be depleted. It's a little bit case by case, but it doesn't mean having it, for instance, doesn't mean having specifically carb loaded or anything extravagant like that. It just means that you've eaten a good normal diet and you feel ready to exercise. So I would say for a lot of the time for runners, if you're running for less than an hour, unless you're doing a particularly hard, say, track interval session and you want to perform at your best, then you might use a sports drink in between reps. Then really you're not going to need to take any fuel in. Or then there becomes a bit of a grey area between sort of 1 and 2 hours where well-trained athletes will frequently run without fuel for a 90-minute run. I don't always agree with that, but I think if it's a steady pace, if it's a comfortable pace, it's very doable and probably isn't going to present a problem if you're fueling well before and after it. But when you start getting up towards 2 hours plus, I would say almost everyone is going to want to or need to fuel. And depending on the intensity, if you're running easy, that might look like 30 grams of carbohydrate an hour, which is a single energy gel or something like that. If you're running moderately hard, that might be 60 grams an hour. And if you're running really, really hard, you're trying to perform at your best, you've got a very hard simulation run or something like that, you might be up at 75 to 90 grams of carbs an hour at that point. So there's actually, if people want to delve into that question for their own circumstance, we've got quite a useful blog on our website with a chart in it, which you can download, and it really does guide you through exercise intensity, duration, and how much carbohydrate you might need. And I can share a link for that with you.
Thank you to AG1 for sponsoring this episode of the Running for Real podcast. AG1 is the daily foundational nutritional supplement that supports whole body health. I drink it literally every morning. It is the first thing I do when I wake up. It is the only ritual I am able to keep. I gave AG1 a try because I knew, even with the best of intentions, I was not getting in everything I needed to get in, especially when it came to fruit and vegetables. And with my past of going a bit too far in terms of orthorexia, being a bit obsessed with clean eating, I really try to eat what I feel like in the moment. And honestly, with 2 young kids, sometimes that's not always the best of choices, but AG1 fills in all those gaps of things that I am missing. It tastes good. It has 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food source ingredients. It is wonderful. So I drink AG1 first thing I do when I wake up. I stumble my way downstairs, go to the fridge, open the door, fill the AG1 container up with cold water, add a scoop before I begin my day, and it makes me feel ready to go. I feel strong. I feel energized. It is enough for me to run with. And I just really love taking care of my body in that way. Athletes love it. Entrepreneurs love it. Busy paced, high energy. Those of us with hectic lifestyles, we all love it. It is like an insurance policy for your body and your mind. So I really encourage you to go check it out if you have not already. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase, which are ideal when you're on vacation. Go to drinkag1.com/Tina. That's drinkag1.com/Tina. And I just want to remind you, this offer is valid for in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in the UK. All of you get that special offer without all the additional customs prices. Go check it out. Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes for that. So that will help, and I want to, at this moment, recognize to the listener, a lot of the questions here are going to be, it depends on you. And so with this, Precision has been really thoughtful and intentional with, here you go. Here's something free for you to check out to figure that out. And this is, one of those tools. So appreciate that. So then continuing on with fuel, what about after a run? Is it, another one of the questions that came in from Sally is, do you really have to take carbs and protein within that window after a run? And if so, what is that duration of time after the run?
So the idea of taking carbs and protein quite soon after running, usually within 30 to 60 minutes, is that research indicated that there's they called it, I think it was called a window of opportunity, where your muscles are a little bit more open to restocking with glycogen and repairing if you get sufficient fuel in during that time. I would say for most people, if you're an athlete who's training very hard, and certainly if you're training multiple times a day, so if you're someone who is running in the morning and the evening, for example, then refueling quite aggressively and quite soon after you finish the first run is extremely important, because you haven't got long until you've got to go again, and your window of time for refueling is limited. So taking in carbohydrates and potentially protein with them. The protein is kind of there because it also stimulates insulin release, and that helps with uptake of carbohydrate into the muscles and the cells. And yeah, generally that's going to speed up recovery. It's the importance of it is almost entirely in relation to the length and intensity of the session you've just done and what you're doing next. So if you've been out for a really long and hard run, it definitely pays you to refuel more aggressively, more quickly, because otherwise you're delaying the recovery process. Obviously, if you've gone out for an easy 30-minute run and then you've not got a hard day the next day, the pressure's off a little bit, and I think you can be a lot more relaxed and just free flowing about what you do.
Okay.
And you'll see that with the sort of attitudes of professional athletes versus, people who run casually, in that professional athletes will always be carrying around snack bars and gels and things like that. We'll always know. You just see them; they're never far from the next snack, because it's part of them doing their job properly. Most of them are training twice a day, at least a few times a week, or putting in some significantly hard sessions.
Yeah.
The rest of us, maybe we can be a bit more casual about it. But to your point earlier on about, kind of goals around, if people have goals around weight loss and that kind of thing, it's one of those areas where it becomes quite important to understand the difference between calorie restricting in a positive way to like not overeat versus denying your body what it needs to recover. And I think that for most runners, like eating a high carbohydrate snack after you've finished is probably more of a net benefit than it is anything else.
Okay. That's helpful. Thank you. All right. So 2 questions from the community about fuel, and then we are going to spend a good chunk of time on hydration here, and then see where we go beyond that. One is from Jim that says, how long does it take for nutrition to be available for use? I've heard that if you take a gel less than 30 minutes before the end of your race, it's too late.
Yeah, generally speaking, simple carbohydrates will get into your system within 10 or 15 minutes. So I would say actually taking a gel 30 minutes before the end of a race, especially if you expect to finish fast or want to finish fast, is a really good idea, because that energy is going to come available just when you need it. That's been studied quite a bit in terms of the absorption rate. It will depend on how well hydrated you are, how hard you're working, but we've tested it quite a bit with these wearable glucose monitors that people have probably seen, the ones that have been adapted for use for diabetics. And it doesn't seem to matter too much whether you take a drink or a gel or a chew or something like that. Anything that's fairly simple carbohydrate, you'll usually see it, you'll take it, and then you'll usually see a small spike in your blood sugar within 15 minutes. And that is a sign that it's in the bloodstream and ready to go.
Okay, that is helpful. And then what about adding in, this is a question from me, just as I have used some of the caffeinated versions as well. When you have a caffeinated gel version like you do, is that, how long does the caffeine take to kick in?
So caffeine, you see caffeine in the bloodstream within 15 minutes usually, but it won't peak in the bloodstream until about 45 minutes. So taking a caffeine gel too late in a race is a mistake some people do make, because they kind of feel like they want to save the kick for the end, and they might actually be saving it for the after party or the massage afterwards. So caffeine, I would say, caffeine peaks in your system after 45 to 60 minutes for most people, and then it kind of degrades and metabolizes away quite slowly. So it might last 2 or 3 hours or more. So that's why if caffeinating, you need to be a bit more in front of it. You usually would, for a running race, you would usually have some caffeine before the start, whatever fits in with your normal patterns of caffeine use. And then depending on the length of the race, if it's a moderately long race, you might start dripping caffeine in relatively early on and taking small to moderate amounts, like 100 milligrams, say, here and there, in order to just keep your levels topped up. If it's a super, super long race, like I did a race, I wasn't running for 24 hours, but we did a team relay the other week when we were running for 25 hours in total. And so I had to stay up through the night. And I actually deliberately abstained from caffeine all day and then started taking it after midnight, and really felt the benefits in terms of keeping me awake in the dark hours. And I think people who are using it in an ultra perspective, that can be super helpful, because when you're naturally, when your circadian rhythms are telling you to go to sleep, if you haven't been on the caffeine, it can provide quite a good stimulus to stay awake.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's go into the big piece here in terms of how many carbs per hour when you were doing a race. Now, you obviously mentioned it depends on the intensity. It depends on how long. There's a different conversation for ultras versus marathons versus anything less than that. But how should someone go about figuring out how much is enough for them? I mean, I'll start this with a bit of a story, in that I told you this when I first came to you with Elizabeth, who had been pushing me to really look at what I was taking on a run, and had made me face the fact that I was taking about 30 to 45 grams of carb in an hour, and telling me that was less than half of what I needed to be doing an ultra like I was preparing for. That was a real shock to me. And, you know, I'm an elite athlete. I have run at a high level, and I could not believe how wrong I was in that moment, and how much I learned from you and learned from Elizabeth. What would you like to tell people listening about, figuring out their carb needs per hour?
Yeah, I think I'd direct people for background back to that blog that I'm going to share with you about how much carb you need per hour, because that gives you a good grounding in the where the science for the recommendations has come from, what it looks like. But if we accept that for most people, we're talking now about races that last more than 2 hours. So if carbohydrate intake is going to be really influential on your performance, you're probably running for more than 2 hours. And then you're going to be immediately in the zone of looking at a minimum of 60 grams per hour, I would say, for really optimal performance if you're pushing yourself hard. And as the events get longer, getting more up towards 90 grams is starting to become commonly accepted as kind of the entry level for, if you like, elite level fueling. We definitely also see on a regular basis now people exceeding that number by quite a bit. So 100, 110, 120 grams is not unheard of. But that's much more confined to the really fast elite runners who've also had considerable practice doing it. So I would say if you look at what you're doing at the moment and it's falling well shy of 60 grams an hour, then I would almost universally be encouraging people to experiment with pushing that up a little bit. I think there's performance gains to be had if you can push it up. If you're in that kind of 60 to 90 band, if you're getting faster and your aspiration is to run really quite hard, then again, going up towards 90 away from 60 is a good idea. But I think from my experience with the majority of recreational or amateur or even like relatively serious amateur runners, if you're in the 60 to 90 grams an hour zone, then it's just a case of sort of playing around with the balance of, can I take on more fuel, but is that going to make me feel uncomfortable or give me GI issues? Because honestly, you're always going to burn more fuel than you can take in. So in one sense, more is always going to be better. But we know that is not true, because you can't just keep slamming more and more in, because you're going to make yourself sick. Yep. So it's finding out where you're currently at, and whether most runners are probably having a similar experience to you, where if they really analysed it, they're probably fueling on the lighter side, unless they're already very intentionally working on this, in which case they know that they're trying to hit certain specific numbers. And although we make sports nutrition products, what I want to be clear on is that don't go looking for magic in any particular product. Like the products that we make, we aim to make them really simple, digestible, very plain in flavour and that kind of thing, so that and very clearly packaged, so that you're getting 30 grams in this gel or 90 grams in this gel. But don't get diverted off your mission here to figure out how much carb you need per hour by wondering whether a hydrogel or a clusterdextrin or a maltodextrin or a fructose or something like that is going to be more important. It's just like that's kind of in the noise until you've really got to grips with getting basically the right amount in.
Okay.
So personal experimentation around those numbers is what it comes down to.
Do you happen to know what the industry average grams is? Like I mentioned the one, I just assumed, I'm taking a gel every 45 minutes. That must be good. But what I was taking in, I think it was between 15 and 20 grams. And I would have had no idea. I thought all gels were created equal in that way. So do you know what the industry average is?
I couldn't quote you an exact average, but I reckon the range would be between 18 and 25 grams of carbohydrate in a standard gel for most people. We opted to make our gel 30 grams because because a lot of the recommendations start at 30 grams an hour, it kind of made sense to have one unit for 30 grams, two for 60, three for 90. It just makes the maths easy on it. Most gels are going to come out somewhere just a little bit south of that. There are a few exceptions, a few ones which have more carbs in. The more watery the gel, so some of them are isotonic and that kind of thing, they tend to have lower calories, but obviously higher fluids. The ones that are more concentrated obviously tend to have more sugars in.
Okay. All right. So let's address, you mentioned about nausea, stomach issues, GI issues. We did have a few questions about that. Anushka asked about this. Also had a question from Robin about this. I also mentioned to you after in my ultra, the final hour or so, I reached a point where I really wasn't interested in eating anything. I don't know if I would maybe call it nausea, but it was kind of like just, for me, I think I was getting in that mindset of like, just get this done. That like flawed mentality of like, oh, I'll eat when I get to the finish line. So let's talk about that, because I think this is a very common thing. So Anushka's question specifically, when you're getting nauseous towards the end of a marathon by the thought of eating something, do you keep running without extra fuel, or do you persist and hope the nausea will subside? She said, I got that during my last marathon at kilometer 35, decided to take it anyway, but then vomited everything. I wonder if I would have been faster if I just not had that last gel.
Yeah, it is an interesting question. And it is a judgment call, I would say, at times, because you and I chatted about this after your race in the context of the question, like, how great do you expect your stomach to feel, during an ultra run? And we talked about the fact that, as a runner, you'll probably expect you will tolerate a savage amount of discomfort in your quads and your calves and your legs, and probably in your back if you're carrying a pack or whatever. But there seems to be sometimes a bit of a unrealistic expectation, in my view, that your stomach's going to feel fine all day long. And you want it to feel as good as possible, like you want your legs to feel as good as possible. But there's also a bit of an inevitability for me that if you're pushing your body really, really hard, including your digestive system, and you're getting a bit dehydrated and it's hot and you're eating the same things for hours on end, you're going to get a bit sick of it and you might feel a bit sick. And it is then down to that judgment call of, am I just getting bored and fed up of this and not really enjoying it anymore? Or is this actually going to make me sick or something, in which case I've pushed it a bit too hard? And I would say that as long as you're staying inside the line of, you're going to have to accept a level of GI discomfort, usually when you're doing a long race, particularly in the heat. You're trading off, like, how bad is that going to get? And is that going to make me sick or slow me down worse than if I take insufficient energy in? Because for sure, if you take insufficient energy in, at some point you're going to slow down. So you've got to do the risk assessment on that. And also then I would say if you're in a long race situation, it's down to having pre-thought about with your crew or if you're using aid stations, with what's available at the aid stations, like what you're going to change it up to, because it might be that you're just getting sick of a certain type of something. A lot of people do getting sick of eating energy gels for hours on end, in which case it's like, well, how about we intersperse in some energy bars or some chews or some real food or something like that? Not because they're necessarily inherently better, because I like to see athletes do a race on very simple, short list of products if they can, because it just keeps everything, it's just one less variable to worry about. Mm-hmm. But if you get to the point where, like, I can't take that anymore, a common one, which you'll have heard loads of people talk about, is they move on to drinking flat Coca-Cola. Yeah. Because usually that's pretty tolerable. It's got loads of sugar in it. It's got a bit of fluids, a bit of caffeine. It kind of can dig you out of a hole if you need it. And so it might be that. You might also, though, in the Western States, where, as you know, we were there the other week, I watched a lot of other crews and saw them having chopped up fruits and things like that for athletes to eat, because in that sort of hot environment, when people's stomachs start to shut down a little bit, maybe having a bit of watermelon and banana or orange or something, it might not be doing you a whole world of good from a calorific point of view. They're not very calorie dense, but it kind of keeps you eating, keeps you drinking, keeps some fluid going in. So I think it's about you've got your plan A when you go into a race of getting your carbs from whatever you're carrying, and then you might have your plan B, which is like, okay, well, if I stray off that, I'm going to try and still keep it open. And as I say, alongside it, don't go in with an unrealistic expectation that, no, my stomach is going to feel brilliant all day long. Like, you're pushing your body really hard. So learn to live with a degree of discomfort.
Just going to take a quick pause here to tell you about my favorite precision fuel and hydration products that I have been using and that we have been talking about in this conversation. So within my 50 mile ultra, what I will be using for my 100K and what I've been using in my training, I use the PF30 gels. I do like the original flavor. I am perfectly happy with that. I also like the original flavor in the chews, but the lemon and mint is also a really good combination in those chews. So I would definitely encourage you to get some of those. I have been using the pH, the Precision Hydration 1500 electrolyte tabs. So I definitely encourage you to get that. And they also have electrolyte capsules. I have only used these once, but that has 250 milligrams of sodium. Again, make sure you check out that planner in the show notes to get your free planner to figure out what you need, you as an individual. There also is the opportunity to get that free consultation. Check out the show notes at runningforreal.com/episode 361. And I want to remind you to use the code Tina sent me if you want to get that 15% off and you want to just go straight over to precisionhydration.com. So let's get back to this episode with Andy Blow. And then with Anushka's specific example here, and also Liz said about chronic nausea while running. She said it starts early and lasts throughout. I've tried every known way of fueling to prevent it. Well, actually, do you want to address that first, that question of it starts early?
Yeah, sometimes nausea can come on for reasons that you might not expect, like overheating. So if you get really, really hot, that can make you feel quite nauseated. And then it's less of an issue. Like, there's nothing you can eat or drink which is going to help that, except maybe taking in really cold liquids if you can get access to them to bring your core body temperature down. Then it's more of a clothing and pacing issue. So you've got to also recognise what's the root cause of this problem. And yeah, there are people whose system seems to be upset by it. Also, I wouldn't rule out the impact of kind of anxiety. We get a lot of people who report that they can train really well on certain products or taking in certain amounts of things, and then come race day with the added stress and adrenaline and those kind of things, that doesn't help. So do you need to attack it to a degree from a psychological point of view? I think that's something which doesn't often get addressed. Okay. I also feel like making sure that you've practiced your nutrition many, many times to the degree you're going to use it in races, in training, is also critical. That's certainly a hallmark of what we see with really elite athletes. I know that because the amount of product that we send to people in the build-up to major races, certainly, if nothing else, indicates that they're using a load of it in their key training sessions, which is great news because it means they're ironing out and they're practicing. Yeah, they're practicing their race day fueling.
Yes, which is very important, something I've talked about a lot over the years. Regardless of what distance you're training for, you want to be practicing definitely in those primary long runs in the build up to a race, but also in, midweek workouts or whatever hard stuff that you're doing. So you're running long distances with it and also hard runs with it. Okay, so final thing with the nausea, would it be, if you are feeling nauseous, if you're not sure where that line is, does it help to take it slowly? Like you take, a gel, but you take it, have a little, like one mouthful every 2 or 3 minutes rather than trying to take it in one go?
Definitely. Okay. Like sort of microdosing your nutrition in is a really good and common tactic as you get later into an event. When I was out in the States a few weeks ago, before Western States, I did a bit of an adventure kind of bike hike up Mount Baldy in California with a friend of mine and a couple of friends of mine. And that was a 12-hour day for us. It was a long day. And towards the end of it, I just had one of our 90-gram gel pouches in my hand, and I didn't really want to be taking much more in, but I was just sipping on it every few minutes and just having a little mouthful and keeping trickling some calories in.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing is just a really good idea, I think, in order to. And I also think being real about it in races, sometimes you just have to, you have to slow down and take stock. You might be feeling nauseous. You could be too hot if you're nauseous. You could also have eaten or drunk too much. Or you might have got the balance of things that you're taking in a bit wrong. So you might have taken in way too much carbohydrate with not enough fluid, for example. And I think being able to if you've gone into the race with a plan for how much you think you're going to have to take per hour, and then keeping a mental ledger as the race goes on, or having your crew help you by keeping track of what you've eaten and drunk, at least then you have an idea that whether taking more of something might help, or whether it's actually taking something away might be better. If you were aiming to drink 24 ounces an hour, but you've only been managing 12 to 16, then maybe that's a sign that the root cause of your problems is a bit of dehydration, and actually slowing down on the solids but increasing the liquids might be the route to go. Whereas if you were planning on 24 ounces an hour and you've already been doing 32 an hour, it's unlikely that pouring more in is going to help. So at that point, I'd be backing it off.
Okay.
So as we keep, it's annoying to say so, but it always does. It depends on the circumstance. But I think keeping a cool head, remembering what you've done, how it compares to the plan, slowing down a little bit, and reevaluating is a good process, whatever the problem is.
Okay.
It can help you on it.
And before we're about to go into the hydration side of things, but you do have, for all these it depends questions, you do have a few ways that people can utilize, what your team offers at Precision. So do you want to go ahead and mention those at this point, just before we get into the hydration side of it?
Yeah, I think the way we try and address these questions and like individualizing is we've got tools on the website. So Fuel and Hydration Planner, which helps you to build a free plan for your event based on temperature, sweat rate, how fast you're going to go, how long you're going to go for. That's a really useful starting point if you want to if you aren't sure how much of everything you might need for an event. The other thing is reading some of the blogs on the website, and then ultimately as well, we offer free video calls with the team. So we love talking to people at any stage of their running, but when we would really most appreciate talking to people is when they've been out and tried a few things, experimented, got a few notes on what they've done, and we can help unpick that on a one-to-one basis. So people can book those through the website.
Yep, and I'll put lots of links in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you. And then as we're going to move on now to hydration, I just want to wrap this up by saying that I did use exclusively Precision in my Ultra. I took a gel and a set of chews every hour on the half hour, I guess. Every half an hour I did one, every half an hour I did the other. And, I felt great. Obviously, the race went very well, and I intentionally, kept this quiet, didn't say anything, because as Andy has mentioned, it's important for them to make sure that you do practice, you do get used to it, and so it's important to know that I did use it throughout my training. I also used it in the race. I'm continuing to use it now, and I just want to mention that fact that. I've loved using it, and it's been made very easy, just because of what you said, Andy, about, having it be 30 grams, so I can easily add it together to get what I'm needing. And I, over time, can be building up how much my stomach is getting used to, coming from a world where I was definitely underfueled. So yeah, wanted to mention that there. Okay, let's get on to hydration. So I have a lot of questions here. The biggest thing I want to start with is I hear all the time about people who get to mile 18 of their marathon and they cramp. Yeah. How do you know if it's an electrolyte cramp versus your body's just not used to running this hard for this long kind of cramp?
Yeah, you're not going to know for sure, really, because cramping is a very multifactorial. It's a tricky situation to unpick. But signs that cramping might be more electrolyte or sodium imbalance related. Certainly, if it's particularly hot and you've been sweating a lot, that's a big sign. We definitely see more instances of cramping in the heat. And that's really true for spring marathons where people have trained through the winter, so they're not used to having to drink and hydrate as much. You get this amazing bumps sometimes around the time of the London Marathon, for example. You can have trained in, single digit Celsius temperatures for the whole time pretty much. And then all of a sudden 22 Celsius on race day. And that's happened in recent years. And then it causes havoc for people because they're just not used to the temperatures. You see way more people getting cramps and suffering. So that can be a sign. If it becomes a pattern that you're doing it, obviously what you can also do is follow a preloading protocol. We've got a blog on that. That involves taking a very strong sodium drink before your event and then dosing appropriately with either salt capsules or electrolyte drinks during the run. Clearly, if your problem goes away, then it was probably related to electrolyte imbalance. If it doesn't go away, it may be a little bit more complicated. I would say that the longer and hotter events are and the later cramps come on in an event, the more chance they are being linked to electrolyte and fluid imbalance. Okay. If you bring it all the way down and say, like, why am I cramping, when I try and kick in a 5K, that's unlikely to be related to fluid and electrolyte loss, clearly, because you've only been running for a few minutes at that point. So there's various things you can look at there. The most, incidentally, and I'm referring back to it a lot, but it is a pretty deep resource. But on our website, the blog about cramping is the most read blog because I think it affects so many athletes. We do a poll every year, and it seems to us that cramping affects, not to a large extent, but to some extent, affects over 85 or 90% of athletes at some point. And it certainly affects over 50 or 60% reasonably regularly. So we've got a lot of good infographics and ideas about what you can do, not just taking electrolytes, but what other things you can try with cramping. And I think what's really tough is when people suffer cramps, the natural tendency is then the next time they go out and do something similar, they throw 5 different interventions at it. Maybe then it works and they just don't cramp, but then they don't really understand what it was that they changed. I think you've got to be a little bit scientific and a little bit rigorous in your approach. Try to recreate the circumstances that cause you to cramp, but then also try one intervention at a time so you really get a sense of whether it's X that is affecting it rather than Y.
Okay.
Evolution, not revolution, is the way I would describe it. Don't just change everything all at once and expect to understand how you got to a new place. It's like take it one step at a time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And as I can hear the seagulls, which are making me a bit nostalgic and sad, because I miss being near seagulls, this reminds me of a question that I do have here that why do we need to have electrolytes? Why not plain water? Why not just throwing some sea salt into water if it's just about sodium?
Yeah, so there is a lot of controversy in sports nutrition about replacement of electrolytes. And I think that comes about because no two cases are similar, and because at one end of the spectrum there are definitely people and situations whereby electrolytes, water is needed, but electrolytes are not. So when you only need to replace a small proportion of your sweat losses, or you're doing something which is in a cool environment, or you don't have a heavy sweat rate, water is predominantly, if not exclusively, what you need, because you'll get enough electrolytes incidentally from foods that you eat. You have a reserve in the body that you can draw upon for a period of time. So at the one end, what we can say for sure is that shorter, cooler events probably don't require electrolytes, or certainly not to the degree longer and hotter ones do. If you do go to right at the other end of the spectrum, like really long, really hot events, and especially for people whose individual physiology leads them to lose a lot of sweat or a lot of sodium in their sweat, or both, they can require quite extravagant amounts of sodium along with fluids in order to stave off dehydration and a condition called hyponatremia. And if we draw those 2 points out as two ends of a continuum, there's not a clear delineation between the two, where there's not a sudden point at which you start needing electrolytes. It's kind of a grey area. So that's always a hard concept to communicate, because a lot of people actually exercise and do stuff in that grey area. So it's like, okay, so what I tend to fall back on there is a bit more of individual experience and individual feel factor for how you're performing. Like, essentially, if you're exercising, I would say if you're exercising regularly for more than an hour, and if you feel like you either struggle or underperform in the heat, then taking in fluids with electrolytes is an easy and cheap and low risk intervention. And if you consistently start to feel better through doing that, then there's a good chance that you are feeling better and it is helping you, and you should continue with that practice. If it makes not a blind bit of difference and you actually just want to drink water, then just drink water. As events get longer and hotter though, and sweat losses mount up, increasingly being open to the idea of experimenting with increasing amounts of electrolytes is important. I'll go back to the cramping example. What people often do is they'll go from maybe taking none at all to taking really high amounts. They'll sort of, you go from volume 0 to volume 10. And I don't think that's always a sensible approach, because athletes are often of a mindset that if I've been told to take something, then like a little bit of it, well, I could take a little bit, but actually a lot of it is going to be better, isn't it? So I'll take loads, you suddenly take loads. And I don't think that's the best approach. I think it's like moving through. That's why we have so many articles and so much educational material around sort of like understanding your body and learning how to dose these things, because the dose matters. When I was experimenting with electrolytes as a triathlete for the first time, doing long, hot races, I look back and I'm almost embarrassed to say that I probably just treated them like some kind of magic element. As long as I was putting a little bit in, that was enough. To your example of like, why can't you just use some sea salt? Well, theoretically you can, because it contains everything you need. But the problem is that if you're like me and you need 1,000 or 1,500 milligrams of sodium with every litre of fluid that you drink in a long race, adding that in terms of plain salt or sea salt is going to taste like seawater. It's going to taste very, very disgusting. You're not going to want to do it.
Yeah.
So
especially when you're nauseous.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where the role of sort of, using products which are designed to get more sodium in without having a salty taste or whatever can be useful. On the other hand, when you go to an aid station in a long race, I think you should absolutely be looking around at stuff and going, does the salty stuff appeal to me? Because if it does, that can be a sure sign that my body's getting a bit low on it, and maybe I should listen to that. And if plain water tastes really, we all know that feeling that sometimes you get when nothing in the world can beat a cold glass of water. And that's just your body saying to you, this is what I need right now. Yep. You should listen to it. What you do, it's a really funny dichotomy of like, you have to think about and plan your nutrition and your fuel and your hydration intake for long races and events. But also you need to be prepared to really not think too hard, not be too dogmatic about the application of that plan as the event wears on and things evolve. And you've got to listen to your body.
Yeah.
Learning when to plan and when to ignore your body and when to lean in and really embrace what your body's telling you is a skill which I just think as a runner, as an ultra runner especially, you just have to learn to develop.
Okay.
And accept the process. It's a journey.
That's really helpful. Okay, so let's talk about let's give a little bit more context in terms of we've mentioned about finding what works for your body, exactly what you just said there. Sometimes you have to think about it ahead of time. Sometimes you have to just trust it in the moment. Let's talk about, the night before a race, the morning of the race. How much should you be hydrating? And how do you find that balance between well hydrated, overhydrated, and constantly needing to pee? And you've mentioned about the sweat test. You've mentioned about some of the resources you have, so you can give, reminders to go check those out. But that, I think, is something that we kind of struggle with. How do you know how much is too much, how much is not enough?
Yeah, in the days leading up to a race, especially a long and hot race, athletes can quite often be guilty of overhydrating. We know this because of personal experience, and there are also research papers out there that have taken blood samples from athletes at the start line of ultramarathons and shown that an anomalous proportion of them, a proportion that you wouldn't find in the day-to-day population, have got low blood sodium levels. Mm-hmm. So the only way that's happened is because they've drunk a load of water in the days before, being worried about dehydration, but actually flushing the electrolytes out of their body in the process.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty common. And I'm sure if you go to any expo before an event, every runner there is walking around with a water bottle glued to their hand or a hydration pack on or something. And I think the main message there is that, you don't want to go into an event dehydrated, so you're definitely not going to abstain from drinking in the days leading up. You're also, if you're eating a higher carbohydrate diet and carb loading, you might need a little bit of extra fluid because glycogen stores water with it, and you've got a high requirement for fluid as a result. But we're talking about like an extra glass or two of water with a meal and like a little bit in between, but not just glugging loads and loads of additional water.
Mm-hmm.
If you're just peeing and peeing, and you're peeing clear all the time. Like when I did sports science, we were told if your pee is clear, it's a really good sign that you're well hydrated. So of course, that there's some truth to that in the sense that, when your body's got more water on board, it will dump more urine, and that urine will be clearer. But that doesn't equate to like good hydration always. If you're peeing more, it is just a sign. It can just be a sign that you're drinking too much. So I would say every circumstance is different. If you're traveling to a race, if the race is in a hot climate, you're going to want to drink more on the plane, in the car, on the way. When you're walking around, you need to increase your fluid, but only by a bit. Only by a bit that is proportional to the amount more that you're losing because of the stress of that the environment's placing on you. Mm-hmm. The other thing to do to ensure that you're not diluting your electrolyte levels down, in my opinion, is to salt your food. So start to put salt on your food in the last 2-3 days before an event, because that is a bit of a fail-safe against overhydrating and diluting your sodium levels down. There's no harm in having a bit of extra sodium on your plate for most people during that period.
Okay.
Because you're going to be excreting a lot out in the race. Then really the next thing is like the morning of the race. We advise most athletes to do something called a sodium preload, which is just essentially fancy way of saying take a strong electrolyte drink before you start, about an hour before you start. We've got a product called pH 1500, which has 1500 milligrams of sodium in a litre. We usually recommend taking half a litre, about 16 ounces of that, about an hour to 90 minutes before you start, because the extra sodium that's in it pulls into your bloodstream, it pulls water with it, it expands your blood volume, and you but it does that without you needing to pee so much. So although anxiety and nerves before the race kick in for most normal people, and you are going to pee a bit more than normal before the race, you're not exacerbating it because you're not taking loads of extra plain water.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. And the pH 1500 was what I used throughout my ultra for my electrolyte needs, and found it worked really well. Made it very easy. Although I'm glad Ryan warned me this. When you put it in your pack, in your bottles, and you put it in, he reminded me to like squeeze the nozzle. I don't know what you drink it out of every like minute or so until it was dissolved, because otherwise you're like pff, and it because of the the gas in it. Yeah. So I'm glad he said that to me, or it would have exploded in my face. And
we see that all the time. No, it's a good tip. The other thing you can do there actually as well is that stuff works perfectly well if you mix it up, the evening before.
Yes.
And let it go flat, mix it in. But yeah, it's a good pro tip, that one.
Yeah. Is there, okay, so bringing it back around, is there anything you think we've missed on the fueling side, on the hydration side, electrolytes? Obviously, we're going to put the tools in there that you can go use, the blog posts. We're going to have extensive notes in the show notes so you can go read, and you don't have to make notes all the way through this episode. We've also got, as we said, a link to the consultation if you want to take that up. We'll have lots of links to the products that I used that you can check out. Anything else we've missed, Andy, that you want to mention at this point?
I think the only other thing that a lot of athletes would benefit from as they get a little bit more serious in their running journey is learning what their sweat rate is. So measuring their body weight before and after training sessions and races to see how much weight you're losing, because there's an easy equation, certainly in metric terms anyway. 1 kilo of body weight loss is equivalent to about 1 litre of sweat lost. So you can get a good handle on what your sweat rate is and what your fluid deficit is after runs and after races by just using a set of scales before and after. We've got a blog with a downloadable spreadsheet in it. So we've got the equations in there. So literally all you need to do is punch in your numbers and it will spit out a sweat rate for you. And then that can be a really useful process in understanding whether you're someone who's a light sweater, a moderate sweater, a heavy sweater, because that then informs the sort of predictions on how much you might need to drink during a race. So I'd say that's probably the only other sort of thing at this stage that's worth mentioning is getting a handle on your sweat rate is very cheap. In fact, it's basically free if you own a pair of scales, and can really enhance your performance if you're doing stuff where you're running for longer periods in the heat.
Okay. This is the one instance I will recommend listeners use a scale. I hope you don't own scales, but if you do own scales hidden away somewhere, you can pull them out for this or use them in a gym or somewhere else. Andy, scales are not my favorite thing in the world.
Yeah, no, I completely understand that. And I think it is because it's weighing yourself is an emotive, thing for a lot of people. And I reckon, but if you can become comfortable with it from a performance perspective, it's a really useful test. If you really don't want to do it, get some tape and tape a little bit of cardboard over and have someone else read the numbers for you and write them down.
Well, and this is a one and done thing. You don't have to do this every time. This doesn't mean you do it before everyone. But do you replace 100% of what you lose when you figure that out?
Not during a run, no. You would probably want to limit your losses to somewhere within 2 or 3% of your total body weight. So that is, for most people, again, individual variation applies. But for most people, if you're staying within 2 or 3% of your body weight loss, you're probably doing a pretty good job with your hydration. Performance tends to drop off beyond that, and certainly in long races, you want to be careful that you're not getting seriously dehydrated early on, because that's obviously going to hamper your performance.
For sure. Okay, Andy, I know I've thrown a lot at you today. Really appreciate your answers. Really appreciate your thoughtfulness. And as I said to the listeners before, I used precision in my ultra. I used it in my 1 mile. I had a gel before I did that. I used it in London. I used it in Boston. I've been using it for months. And Andy knows this. Only one other person knows this. I have signed up for an ultra in the fall, 100K, and I will be using precision for that. So I'm already starting my practicing with it. So I encourage you to go check it out. There's lots of links in the show notes. And thank you so much, Andy, for joining me and demystifying a lot of the confusing, conversations and information out there. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. And thanks for all the questions for everyone who sent them in. That's really cool.
The Running for Real podcast and everything we do here at Running for Real would not be possible if it wasn't for the Running for Real team. While I am the person who you hear from most often and maybe the face of the brand, the rest of our team are such critical pieces of what we do. And without them, I think I'd just be running around in circles with ideas. So I want to take a moment to thank our team. To Jeremy Nessel, who's been with me since the very beginning. Kat McKay, Sally Pontarelli, Kelsey Wang, Sandy Gutierrez, Louise Murphy, Andrew Basola, Alexandria Will, and Maria Vargas. Thank you to each and every one of you for all that you give to Running for Real and our community. I appreciate you, and I'm so thankful for having you as a part of the team. Wow, that was a jam-packed episode with so much good information in there from Andy. I'm glad we had a sports scientist on to answer all those questions. And as I mentioned, I do not think my race would have gone how it did had I not had a conversation with Andy in the few months to go and had Elizabeth in Pine, one of my best friends, not pushed me into having that conversation about my fueling. Now, remember to check out those links in the show notes. You can get that free planner to figure out exactly what you need for your fueling. You can also get the free consultation Andy mentioned. And of course, you can sign up to go get yourself some of the precision gels chews or hydration, whatever you are needing right now, be sure to go to the link in the show notes at runningforreal.com/episode 361. You will also see links to our other sponsors, AG1, where you can get that free 1-year free supply of vitamin D3 K2 plus 5 free travel packs, and Allbirds. Go to that link, and if you use that link and you add a pair of socks to your cart, you will get that for free. Thank you so much for listening today. I'll see you on Monday for a Together Run, on Wednesday for a For Real episode, and Friday for another one of these. And if you haven't pre-ordered Becoming a Sustainable Runner, that is the biggest way you can support me. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.